Kansas. And you watched them, and it was like, no, Kansas is not good at all. But it was impressive to see. And then they kept it rolling. And it's a really cool story because I think normally a school like that would not have gotten much of the spotlight. I'm not saying they got a lot of it, but they got a little of it.
How much of that story is built around what's happening now? Like, I mean, I hate to use the term silver lining in a situation like what we're in, but is just a result of the field being open with, the Pac-12 not being around and the Big Ten. Like, how much of that is just this?
I think there's a chunk of it. I mean, look, the Sun Belt got a lot of attention early on in the season. Coastal is one of the Sun Belt schools, as is Louisiana, the Ragin' Cajuns, sometimes called ULL, and also Arkansas State. Each of them beat a Big 12 conference school. Iowa State was a team that went down. That's a good team. K-State is a pretty good team. Arkansas State got them. And so that first weekend, they got a lot of attention when they normally wouldn't have. And I think because of some of those things, I think people were looking for stories. And when you didn't have a lot, you basically had the Big 12, you had some of the ACC playing, the SEC hadn't come back yet. So I think that's why people were gravitating towards anything they can get. I mean, I can't tell you, I probably watched Central Arkansas play a couple of games this year, and I'm not sure anybody else would have been doing that in a normal year, but they played.
Perhaps you've never heard of one Scottie Pippen, Bruce?
Yes, I have. But that was the only reason why I knew of them until this year.
Well, I mean, you guys, I'm just saying, you guys could have done a Zoom and watched the game together. It would have been pretty fun. I mean, that's a story in the COVID age.
It's crazy. Central Arkansas has a guy who was on my freaks list this year. It's a cornerback. He is a cornerback who's about 6'1", can jump through the roof, and will probably be a top 100 pick in the draft. But, it's crazy because they were in the first game of the season on TV, and then they played North Dakota State, who's an FCS powerhouse, with Trey Lance, who's probably going to be a first-round pick. He's the quarterback there who put up ridiculous numbers as a true freshman. So you had this kind of program that outside of Scottie Pippen, nobody had ever paid attention to. And all of a sudden they got at least somewhat of a little bit of a spotlight for them.
I mean, you never know. We're not that far removed from the idea of, paying attention to Boise State would have sounded insane. Like, the idea that anybody would care about that program. And, they're now one that gets paid attention to. Wasn't that long ago.
Yeah, it was just, again, and credit to Chris Peterson, because I think they had been good before he took over, but he really elevated it. As Dan Hawkins left there to go to CU, and then all of a sudden, it wasn't just the blue turf. There was a lot of cool things that were gone on, and obviously they've produced a lot of good players.
It wasn't not, though, the blue turf. I mean, that it was still part of it.
Well, you've seen what Coastal's turf looks like, right?
No. I mean, look, it won't take you long to figure out. I don't watch a lot of college football. I have not been paying close attention. I didn't realize they were this good until I was doing the reading and, whatever, because you were coming on the show. And so I saw that, and I thought initially when I saw your rankings for this week, I was like, he's making like a goof because you have space for that this year. But no.
And the color of their turf, I don't know if you can, if everyone else can see it, but it's like you are in the show. It's that color of my text block. That's what the color of the turf is.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So
that's cool. So how do you know who's good this year when Indiana has played twice and, the Pac-12 is starting this week and there's no interconference play and all, like, how do you know who's good?
We don't. We really don't. It's the poorly kept secret. It's a lot of subjectivity in a sport that's dripping with subjectivity normally. And so, you're going to look at, Pac-12 is starting this weekend. They're going to play each other, and that's it. There's no Oregon playing Ohio State and Oregon playing North Dakota State. There's no USC playing Alabama. Those games were supposed to happen. Michigan was supposed to play Washington, but obviously with the pandemic, that's out the window. So, all you can do is win the games that you play, and you hope that if you're team trying to get in the playoff that you have enough wins to get in. I mean, the Pac-12 at best will be 7-0 if it's a Pac-12 champ. Is that going to be enough when already people feel like pretty comfortable in thinking the three best teams clearly are Ohio State, Alabama, and Clemson in some order? So that would leave one other spot, assuming one of those schools doesn't really, really stumble. And I don't know who's going to get that spot, but I'm pretty sure it's not going to be Coastal. Let's put it that way. But so I'll give them some love in my top 10 column when it's some, it's kind of warranted.
I have to admit, and I think I speak for Brian with this, it's been a season right now for me with college football where I think, to put it kindly, ambivalent, just because I have a hard time with the idea of college athletes even wanting to be out there and, being out there of their own volition, them being unpaid. It really tests the idea of amateur and, student athletes. From your perspective and what how well informed do you think the athletes are in terms of risks that they're taking, long-term prognosis, or, I guess what we know about, potential long-term effects with COVID, and like just their ability to truly make their own decisions in all of this?
Well, I think they're about as well informed probably as pretty much anybody else who we see on social media. I'm
not sure that's encouraging.
Yeah, I don't know how, I mean, that's probably the worst non-answer I could give you, but I think there is
it's the most alarming, Bruce.
Yeah, but I think there's something out here where we're all in our own sort of echo chambers. And I hate to say this because God forbid there are people who are all the way I'm about to say this, but I think if you're on Twitter a lot, which I have to be for work, which a lot of, you get this echo chamber of who you follow, who shows up in your feed, and it can be mind numbing, right? And so whatever values or things you think they get tested because of what's around you. And we're in a pandemic. Everything is evolving. I mean, I think the things that we may have thought 8 months ago, maybe we're not so sure about, right? And so I did a story that did well, at least, business-wise for The Athletic, right after the Pac-12 made its decision, similar to right after the Big Ten made its decision to postpone. And I talked to a lot of people who were on the call that basically it was the ADs, the conference commissioner, the coaches, and their medical experts. And the coaches in the Pac-12 were pretty alarmed by a lot of the stuff they'd heard, especially about as it relates to heart issue concerns relating to COVID. Also, there was testing issues out here at the time in Southern California, certainly, and in some other pockets of the Pac-12. And I think that some of those things now, like there's been some pushback, and there's been pushback, the Big 12 went all in on playing in part because they had a medical expert who is from the Mayo Clinic. It's not like they found some random guy off the street. I mean, this is somebody who's certainly well credentialed, who was very strong and outspoken about what he thought the risks were, what he thought the data was telling them on some of these things. And basically the medical experts in with the Big 12 and certainly the ACC and the SEC, I think we're giving them different rationale than what the Big 10 and the SEC and Big 10 and the Pac-12 were giving them. And I don't know, the games are going on, and as best we can tell, nobody who is involved in these programs has gotten very sick, meaning has been hospitalized. Now, here's the thing with this. Schools will, not all, but some schools will release information, how many players tested positive, how many coaches tested positive. Sometimes you'll hear asymptomatic. No one's releasing, well, Johnny Smith went to the hospital, he's having respiratory issues or anything like that. So unless it's really anecdotal, so unless we've heard from, in the case early on, it was the mom of an Indiana football player who said
Right.
her son had gone to the hospital, and she posted it on a Facebook grouping. But by and large, there's roughly 13,000 college football players in major college football. You would have thought you would have heard more if there was more going on. And that's not to say that I don't know what the death toll is in the United States right now. It's 225,000, or it's somewhere I know over
like that,
200,000. So, and as we're, like what happens is you would let's say you get figures from the University of Indiana or the University of Michigan, and they say that they have tested X number of players, and six have been positive, and you just tweet out what comes in the press release, and you'd get people going like, I don't understand, what's your point? Well, I'm not having a point here. I'm just saying what the school is saying, right? I'm not saying whether that's a huge number. I'm not saying whether that's, but then you get a lot of people going, they're 18 to 22, they're going to be fine, and you get that over and over again.
Yeah,
and I think, by and large, it sounds like that, and what I had wondered about is the players are, yes, 18 to 22. There's a lot of coaches who are 50 and up, and some of them aren't in very good shape, and some of them are 60 and up. And yet we really have not heard of any hospitalizations. Now, just today, a really big recruit that Clemson had 2 years ago, Xavier Thomas, he's a defensive lineman. I think he's probably 19 or 20 years old. He had talked about his battles with COVID and said, he was struggling breathing for a couple of months. Now, that's significant.
Yeah.
That's one of the few stories I've heard of a college football player talking about that. And so, getting through all this is just like, I think that has probably, like, go back. Obviously, you guys are very versed in basketball. Remember the night like Rudy Gobert gets it, and a bunch of stuff happened. I don't know if this was the exact same night, but at one point I think it was a Big Ten tournament basketball game, and Fred Hoiberg was on the bench, and they showed video of him, and it was like,
right. He looked awful.
Yeah, hacking coughs, and it was like, oh my God, Fred Hoiberg's going to die on national TV, or from COVID, or just. And then I think it turned out he didn't have it, and I think the way we looked at the virus at that point, and again, not to diminish it at all, but I just think that when I heard Tom Hanks and his wife had it, you thought, oh my God, they're not going to make it. And then like Rudy Gobert, and I'm blanking on some of the other NBA players right in the beginning, but
Donovan Mitchell.
These are the best athletes in the world, best conditioned athletes. They're also younger. So it doesn't mean that there haven't been 22-year-olds who are fit, who have had really bad times with this. But I think you're kind of balancing that. So when you say, do the players know? I think the players know, but remember, the players also know that there's a lot of risks playing football now. They've heard the stories about CTE, and they've heard some of those things. I mean, we were all 20 once, and there's a lot of stuff we did that we're like, you take your chances with it. And I think there's a lot of people, not just college football players, who feel that way. So, it's ultimately, you keep your fingers crossed that everything stays on track, but it's just kind of like, you're almost shrug your shoulders at a lot of this.
Last thing is about this, and before we get into some of the stuff with the book, how do you think people are going to look back on this season? Whether it's trying to the disparate amount of games, or Trevor Lawrence, he's now out for however long, I guess that lasts, and when it's all said and done, I guess they're gonna be bowl games, and they'll crown a national champion. And so, when we look back at the season in 5 years, 10 years, what are we going to think about?
Well, hopefully there will be no tragic moment or anything that kind of causes, because there's going to be games postponed. There's already been games canceled in the Big Ten with Wisconsin. There was some rocky moments in the MLB season, right? With the Cardinals and the Marlins, and certainly the Justin Turner thing with the Dodgers at the end was pretty wild. I think that, to me, a lot of people are like, well, you're going to have maybe a 7-0 team and a 10-0 team in a playoff, and how fair is this going to be? That this and I think, I'm not saying this is an asterisk season, but there is no, unlike the NFL, unlike the NBA, or unlike the WNBA, or unlike the NHL, there is no bubble in college football, and there's also 100-person rosters. You're on college campuses. Only recently, with a couple of the leagues, have you gotten daily testing. The Sun Belt, I think, is testing once a week. Wow. So there's a lot of roll of the dice going on here. And my case, my point on some of this is, I talked to an AD at a school that had a big win early in the season, and I just asked him. We were just having a conversation, really. And one of the things that I took away from it was, if your school normally has a big win, normally the players go out and they get together with their buddies, or they go to a bar, they go to a frat party, whatever they do. But that's the unwind. Now you can't do that, because if you do, then you risk bringing it back into what they're trying to consider is their own bubble. It's not a bubble, but this is as close as they can get to it. And so I think for the players and the teams that manage it the best, it's not to say that, like, Boston College, sticks out to me as a school that almost never has had positives. I mean, their numbers have been pretty remarkable. Hopefully I didn't just jinx them, but throughout this have been pretty remarkable, and they've had a nice year. But there's other teams who are going to have, like Clemson's had a ton of positives before Trevor Lawrence, and so when I say how do they manage it or whatever, but I think there's so many challenges that are going to come with this season because of everything going on around, much less you didn't have an off season what to speak of. I think that whoever does, make it to the title game and win it, I think there's going to be a unique aspect of it. And I don't think there'd be like any asterisk to it. I just think it'd be something that's, we're in 2020. It's a really effed up year, and just, however it's going to be, like, one thing that's come that I feel like I've heard a bunch of times, people have said, and I think I've heard this a bunch because it's like I've written books. It's like, when they write the book about 2020, I'm like, who's going to want to read that? I don't, I just want to get it over.
Have you seen the trailer for the new Michael Bay movie that was sort of cut, I think, during Corona? And it's the whole premise is, the virus mutates, and it's year 4 of full lockdown. I saw the first 30 seconds of that. I was like, nope, not watching that.
Yeah. I lived, as you guys know, like we all had ESPN magazine roots at some point, and I lived in New York during 9/11. And so I remember that day very vividly. And for a while, I would watch almost anything that was about, just kind of about that day. And now that's a long time ago, but this part, I'm like, I don't even like, I didn't like reading about it too much, just because it was just exhausting. Right. And so the whole year's been exhausting, and I'm thankful that college football is back. And I had a football coach say something which I really don't think was profound when he didn't think about it at the time, but he said, there's a big difference between being back and being back to normal. And I don't know when we're back to normal, but, I know when I go into Fox, we have I'm in the studio this year. And so we get drug tested. We get tested.
That's a scoop.
That would be,
hey now. But let's be honest. Could you blame anyone?
No, not right now. No. When
they've got to at least give you guys some allowances if you're drug testing. Like, okay, these couple drugs, it's all right, but
they should hand you guys edibles on the way into the studio.
It's the way things are.
Can you say anything on this show right now?
Yes.
Okay. So we're going to go back to ESPN magazine for a minute here. So when I started at ESPN, it was basically, I was like became the first hire on what became ESPN.com. So it was 1994. I actually did get drug tested to get hired there. I had to get drug tested.
Really?
Yeah. I worked in Bristol. I got drug tested. Well, anyway, probably a month or two after the magazine launched, I transitioned down from Bristol to New York. And when I was in high school, I smoked weed, but like the drugs that were happening in our office were like, that was a different deal for me. Now I didn't partake in that stuff, but it was way different. And so it like we would have these, those next parties, and I just remember it was like some of the people I was friends with were like, whoa, they were way into it. And that kind of blew my mind because I was just like, it was just a different scene than I was used to.
Put the E in entertainment.
There was yes, there was definitely one. I won't say who it is, but one of our writers.
Please don't. As curious as
when we said you could say anything, we probably shouldn't say it. There is probably some border to
I'm going to be honest. This is actually news to me because
I didn't know about this.
We were working on the West Coast, and I mean, we weren't in the offices maybe 4 times. This is brand new.
Yeah, it was funny. So my first year there, I lived halfway in between Bristol and New York because I was going back and forth. And so we would play basketball at Chelsea Piers. And one night I remember like I got dropped back off at the magazine office on whatever 19 East 34th Street. And I was waiting for like a car service to take me back to Connecticut. I was over where my space was, which was kind of in front of that big scoreboard. And one of our writers, who was a big partaker, came into the office not knowing that anybody else was in there. And there was somebody else in the office who I think would supply him with some of his party favors. And I like heard the ruckus, and all of a sudden it was like being in like one of those old cartoon skits where like the cartoon character just goes into the room and just like stuff is flying out. He was like ransacking this. And I was like, what's going on? And so I'll leave it there. But it was a lot of crazy stuff that went on there.
Jeez, like when we showed up, it was just like, dudes playing ping pong. I mean, like,
yeah, I think I
thought the office was pretty cool, but like, I guess I missed some good stuff.
The first couple of years was way different than probably like after maybe the 4th or 5th year.
Yeah, we were just on the West Coast writing jokes for the front of the book.
The occasional profile of a pro bass fisherman or the bull riding circuit.
Right. So, I mean, Bruce, I assume like, you've started another book tour and like, it's pretty standard. Like you have to go through the slog of telling the drug stories before they let you talk about the book. So
yes.
It's one of the book is it's Flip the Script. It's with Ed Orgeron, Lessons Learned on the Road to a Championship. And one of the things I think is kind of cool about it, you wrote Meat Market, which is all about recruiting. And Orgeron, like he's the thing that you knew about him, like when he came to USC, was recruiting. What was that world like when Ed was in it, like, and what made him so good at it?
So he learned under Jimmy Johnson when Jimmy Johnson was at University of Miami. So that was the glory days of the Hurricanes. I mean, he coached Cortez Kennedy and Russell Maryland and later Warren Sapp, and he coached The Rock. By the way, The Rock wrote the foreword of the book. So
that was a good get. I'm not going
to lie. It was a good get. That's why his name is on the cover and not mine, by the way. I'm on the inside cover.
Smart play. I mean, no offense. Don't take this the wrong way, but it's a good call.
So he learned how to evaluate under Jimmy Johnson, which is Jimmy Johnson, as most people know in football, was one of the best evaluators. It carried over obviously from college to the NFL with the Cowboys. And he also spent time under Pete Carroll. He and Pete Carroll really helped build USC into a powerhouse. And so he felt a couple things. He felt very strong in his ability to evaluate players. A lot of people in recruiting wait to see who else offers somebody. Mm-hmm. He wants to be the first one in the boat, as he would put it, because then he felt like that kid would be loyal to him because, hey, I was the first one who believed in you. And kids, when they're getting pitched from everywhere and people are coming at him at every turn, he felt like that gave him an edge. The other thing that was big with him, which I didn't know going in. So when I worked on Meat Market, I knew him, but I didn't know exactly what made him tick. And one of the things that really jumped out at me was I knew when he was at Miami, he lost his job because his partying got way out of control. And he's 20 years sober, but he'd been in recovery. He's in recovery, but he'd gone, battled it for a while head on, been not false starts, but there was
relapse is part of recovery.
Yeah, it was a hard time for him. And so what I realized, and we talked about this a lot in Meat Market, was he basically, because he was such an adrenaline rush guy, he loved the chase, and the chase when he's out for whatever the next big high or whatever you want to say about his partying, and that adrenaline rush is basically channeled into he's a relationship guy and he's a people guy. But I think a big part of that was also he channeled that thing and that drive into recruiting. And he is obsessed about recruiting in ways that I don't think there's any other head coach who's like that. Now there's some, Nick Saban's a great recruiting head coach. Bobby Bowden was a great closer. Urban Meyer's regarded as but I don't think they worshiped it the way this guy does, right? Because at the core, some of those other guys have their guys who handle their database, and he's hands-on, like this is his thing. And so he loves the high school coaches. He loves to meet the aunt, the grandmother, the whoever is in the picture. And so that part of it, I think, was such a big deal to him. So you have the guy who's really confident in his ability to evaluate, when quite honestly, I don't think a lot of coaches are that confident about it, because it's different. Like one of the things we got into in Meat Market at the beginning was just how different the evaluation aspect is compared to what it is in college basketball. College basketball, most of the best players get together at some of these sneaker camps or whatnot, and they basically play the sport they're playing. In college football, even if you go to a combine, there's no pads. It's just way different. And also, like in college basketball, like I remember back when I covered college basketball, Tracy McGrady blew up at a sneaker camp. Mm-hmm. It was from somewhere in Auburndale, Florida, or somewhere in Florida, before he went to Mount Zion. But he just blew up there, and then all of a sudden, a couple of years later, he's in the NBA. In college football, it's not that way. I mean, yes, you have guys like Trevor Lawrence or Justin Fields, but for the most part, like the guy who is 6'4", 230, he may grow to be 6'4", 270, right? Bodies need to develop. They're in different systems. So there's a lot of projecting. And there's a lot of guys, there's a lot of 5 stars and 4 stars who don't pan out. There's a lot of 2 and 0 stars who end up being NFL stars, right? So I think there's a lot of that subjective nature. So just because he was so passionate about it, like Meat Market wasn't initially going to be a book. It was supposed to be a magazine article. And I went down to Oxford, Mississippi for 3 days, and I came back. And within 20 minutes of being down, I was like, man, I got a great story. And I went home, and I don't know if you guys remember Neil Fine.
Yeah, sure.
Was like the top of the editing food chain for the college football side. And I told him what I had, and he said, you have a book. And I was like, I thought about it, but I'm like, I don't know if I want to move to Mississippi to write this book. I'm not ready for that. But, it was a big change in my life. But so from there, it really, you started to see a path into a different world that, quite honestly, even though I covered college football, nobody's like behind the curtain and a fly on the wall the way I got to be for 2 years. So that really was like kind of career changing for me.
It's interesting when you mention the relationships that Ed Orgeron looks to build during recruiting, and then that personal connection. I thought it was interesting how you pointed out in the book that after he got fired by Ole Miss, one of the conclusions that he reached was that he needed to yell less at his players, cuss them out less. That I guess temperamentally he wasn't doing the things that he needed to do to reach a next level in coaching. I think that's just really interesting, just in the sense that you have the ability, if you really want to be pretty authoritarian as a college football coach. I mean, you are way more powerful than the players themselves. Mm-hmm. How did he end up reaching that conclusion?
I think some of what really, and this is my analysis, not, it's something we talked about, but I really think, because having covered the sport for 20 plus years, the most stubborn individuals I've ever met, aside from my 6-year-old, are football coaches, right? Like Mike Leach is the most stubborn man alive, in my eye. And a lot of these guys are really smart, but because they have gotten so used to doing things a certain way, and remember, they're not working like 40-hour weeks. I mean, this is basically all they do, and all their personas built around it. So they're really stubborn, and they don't change much if they do. And what was fascinating to me with Ogeron was, and again, I think I attribute a lot of this to what I think has been his being forced, or being willing to be forced, to look internal and examine himself in a really critical light, because he's battling addiction. And that is taking him in a place where most football coaches are not comfortable going. And I'm not saying he's necessarily comfortable going, but he gets it, right? So with that as kind of the core to him, I think, like, one thing I really learned on Flip the Script that I didn't really think about or didn't know was there'd be a lot of stuff that happened in the last few years at LSU where he would say, like, whatever he is, 58, 59 years old now, like, you don't shut off who you are, especially who you are and who's in your DNA. You just learn to deal with it better, hopefully. And some people can't, right? And some people are just, they can't get out of their own way. But in his case, he's learned to deal with it better because he's aware of it. And so he would say to me, and there's a couple of examples, but this is the one that comes to mind directly. So they beat Alabama last year, and it's the first time in like a decade where LSU's beaten Alabama. They go into Tuscaloosa, Joe Burrow lights them up, they win the game. And that was obviously a huge moment for LSU. It was, honestly, at that point, I was like, I got a book, because I'd already had something in mind. I was like, once they won that game, I'm like, this book is made. But what happened was, in the post-game locker room celebration, one of his players had his cell phone out, and took a video of it and posted something on Instagram. And it wasn't like the most horrific stuff, but it was Ogeron. Basically, there was some rough language, and basically I think it was like, kind of roll tide, F you kind of stuff. And so when I asked him about it, he said that the player apologized and came up, and he said, the old me, being the old him that used to coach at Ole Miss, probably would have turned it into a 2-day story, because I would have been pissed off that I was disrespected or whatever, and taken it personal and made it worse. When in reality, I thought about it, I was like, if this was my son, he made a really stupid decision, not a horrific decision. It's not like it was like this player was drinking. It's like,
he broke the code. He did, he did the wrong thing. Absolutely.
Yeah, but it was just bad judgment. But he said,
if
my son did that, I'd be like, all right, don't do it again. You did something wrong. I still love you. Let's move on. And he realized that not only by doing it this way, the rest of the team sees, because this wasn't a great player, but it was a starter. It was like a pretty good player. And that they saw how he supported this guy when he knew he screwed up. But also his thought process was, if I did it the other way, this turns into a 2-day story, as opposed to now it's over in 2 hours. And me having it as a 2-day story in the backdrop where I have to talk about it, and then it gets asked about players and whatever, it's a distraction, and that doesn't do us any good. And so what I think, I kind of realize is, this is the guy who has the same impulses, the same instincts, but has the discipline and the wherewithal and the understanding to go, all right, I get it. That's what I want to do. I can't do it. And I don't know how many football coaches are either savvy enough or self-aware enough or disciplined enough to get out of their own way and stuff like that.
You don't dwell, I don't think, on that, because obviously, there are 2 stints at SC, and you go through the stuff with Pete and what he learned from Pete Carroll and what that era taught him. And I think it's interesting that he was sort of Pete's bad cop and played bad cop at Ole Miss and learned from that. It seemed like that was sort of my reading of it. But the section when he gets back to SC and he takes over for Lane Kiffin, and he has that incredible run at the end of that year. A lot of people kind of look at it and say, well, that was a long time ago. USC is still kind of in that that place. They still have a coach from that coaching tree, no longer an AD from inside the house, so to speak, but they still have the coach there. That episode where Pat Hayden seems, Ed says he's going to hire him, and then they lose to UCLA and he doesn't. What did that say about both Coach O and where he was and who he was at that point, but about USC's athletic department, about where they were at that point?
I think it says, we all live out, know LA. I think it just says that this was a very dysfunctional place for a long time that, quite honestly, succeeded in spite of itself. Like when I moved out here in 2003, they were just getting really good. And they were fun. Pete was a superstar. They had exciting players.
It cannot be overstated how big of stars Matt Leinart and Reggie Bush were. They were like A-list movie stars. It's not an exaggeration.
Yeah, they were fun to be around. Like there was no team that's like this, right, in college football. And Pete is super charismatic. Pete fit here in a, I'm blanking on the writer's name. I want to say it's like J.R. Tolkien, but it's not. But there's a really good magazine writer who did the Agassi book. And it's been a while. But anyway, he did a magazine story on Pete, and it was really fantastic. Like, I don't have that club in my bag. Like, this guy really did an amazing job of showing how competitive Pete was and just kind of Pete's persona.
Or Moringer.
Yeah. He's a brilliant writer. I don't know him at all, but I was just like,
he's a very good writer.
Yeah. Blown away by what he did. And because it was Pete and the way he captured it and the way he delivered it. And so that was USC, man. It was just like, but at the same time, you had Mike Garrett as the AD, and Mike Garrett, he was a great player. He won a Heisman, but like, he was not a great AD. And that ended up blowing up in their face when the sanctions hit because of how he handled it. And then they went for somebody who was more country clubbish, who had big USC ties and had a fancy pedigree and grew up there. And that was Pat Hayden. And Pat's nice, or can be really nice, but it was...
He's brilliant. He is a brilliant guy in terms of just pure intelligence.
He's a Rhodes Scholar, yeah. But he was not an AD. Like, and then they went and they doubled down and they hired somebody who was a better player, but less of a fit. And he was even worse, and that was Lynn Swann. Mm-hmm. And, there used to be an expression that you would hear a lot when I first moved out there, and it would happen around the football program where you'd see like really cool, this was obviously pre-Twitter, but it'd be these digital moments where it'd be like Will Ferrell shows up at practice, or Snoop Dogg is there, or there's a really cool video like of the late Bill Withers singing, like doing a practical joke and then singing in the team room. And it would be like only at USC, they would say. And it's true, because I can't imagine these things, the star power, being pulled off like that. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, then all of a sudden they would do these things. And then it happened when Lane got there. As the head coach, Lane did a bunch of knucklehead stuff that kept on blowing up in his face. It was like he was constantly stepping on the loose floorboard and was getting, slammed in the face. But they were, like only at USC. Like, these things can only happen at USC. And it was kind of like, if I was an alum, and I'm friends with a lot of USC.
I am an alum.
Yeah. And it's just like, you're like, you don't feel bad for them because, it's USC and you have,
right.
Like there's a lot of great things about it, but you're like, man, this must be really frustrating because you can't get out of your own way. And that's USC. And so what's funny, not funny, haha, but what's interesting to me about the USC Ogeron thing is Ogeron loves USC. Like there's a old, late, since passed coach, Marv Gu, who was like this revered, tough guy who embraced all this stuff about USC and was worshipped. And he really made a big impact on Ed. So Ed got USC. Like he revered it, like, like in everything from Ronnie Lott, Marcus Allen, like he's in with those guys, Anthony Munoz, he gets it, right? Like the way John Papadakis feels it, Ed Ogeron kind of feels that. And he was a big part of turning them into a powerhouse with Pete. And, I think he was like living a dream when he became the interim and they beat Stanford on a top 5 Stanford team.
Right.
When they had like only one sub they could use on their basically defense.
Right. Because all the scholarship losses and they were down on players.
Yeah. So I think then to get the rug pulled out from under him, I mean, that hurt him deeply, because he grew up worshiping LSU, but I think it's somewhere along the way, USC really turned his head in a big way. And I think it probably stung even more because Pat Hayden, not saying it directly this much, but was like, you don't belong in that big chair.
Yep.
You're just not. It's whatever the Cinderella story, but Cinderella can't be back there. That's not your place. And I think that is a really, really tough pill for him to swallow. And even like, one of his closest friends is a guy named Brian Kennedy, who the practice field is named after. Big booster. He's one of the guys who's, has a big billboard business out here. And Brian hasn't, since they, basically hired Steve Sarkisian instead of Ogeron, Brian Kennedy's completely cut off from the program. So it's crazy. It's just a really, and it worked out for Ed, and we'll, it's not like, USC's kind of been still kind of puttering.
I was going to say, like, Ed Orgeron, I'm sure he didn't realize it in the moment. He was very open about how this was a bitter, disappointing pill for him to swallow. He really dodged a bullet. I mean, in terms of USC is, forget just football. They've been a mess for a while. I mean, with issues that are much, much more important away from the field. And obviously Ed Orgeron could have been this coach that galvanized the program and, single-handedly led them through this different transition period. But there was a ton of dysfunction that could have just swallowed him up as much as, it swallowed up everybody else. And, regardless of what you think of Clay Helton, for example, as a coach, it's clear he has not been able to conquer it, no matter how good you think he is, or I guess how bad you think he is. And this could have ended up something that ultimately derailed Ed Orgeron, as disappointing as
you fail once, it'll miss. It's okay. The second time, but if you fail twice at major programs, now
I never really thought about it until I was thinking about talking with you tonight. But I mean, he really may have dodged a bullet.
Maybe. I mean, look, the thing that's different is eventually the sanctions part eased up. Like, on one hand, there's that, and there's certainly the dysfunction of the president, the AD. I mean, you guys know, and I just as Andy, as you were talking about that, I was thinking about like beyond the athletic issues, massive problems at USC. It's like scandal upon scandal. On the flip side of it, you're taking over the LSU job, and Nick Saban is the greatest coach in college football history, and he's in your division. Like that. Whereas the Pac-12 is there for the taking.
Yeah.
So I don't know. He really has deep roots in West Coast high school football and everything like that. I don't know. I'd be curious what it would have been, because if you had told me where would he have had a better chance to win a national title of the two, I would have said USC, because there's no Nick Saban. There's like, you could dominate
right
12 West Coast football. It's harder to do that in the place he was at, starting from where he was starting.
But college football to me is one of the, it happens in the pros, but I think less so. But college football in particular is very much built around, okay, if you don't win, like this guy's coaching for his job today. If you don't beat Stanford today, you're going to be fired. If you don't beat UCLA, you're going to be fired, which is cosmically, just a cosmically stupid way to handle things, but that's a separate discussion. Pat Hayden clearly didn't want Ed Orgeron to be the head coach at USC. If he beats UCLA, the politics of it maybe make it so it's impossible not to hire him. But now you're the head coach for a guy who really ultimately doesn't want you to be the head coach. I just, and to sort of further what Andy was saying, like, I wonder, like, what that was going to be my question. Like, how does that play out? Because if you don't have the buy-in from the AD and the AD thinks that he has to hire you because he's just got to, that wouldn't have been a good situation. It seems like.
Right. And that's similar to what he had at Ole Miss. He had an AD and Pete Boone, who was a banker, who didn't want him as the head coach. And David Cutcliffe, who was the coach before Orgeron at Ole Miss, and Houston Nutt, who was the coach after him, the three of them have nothing in common other than they're both white males. Other than this, they each don't like Pete Boone, the AD, or trust him. And Ed was super paranoid when I was there, not because of me, but because of the AD. He did not trust him at all. And, I'm not saying Pete Boone is similar to Pat Hayden in that regard, but I think if you're AD and they don't want you, that is a bad place. And I don't know if, I'm sure he was more equipped to handle that, because I think he was more connected to the big money people. Like one of USC's big boosters was Wayne Hughes from Public Storage. And I think, by all accounts, Ed had a strong relationship with him. I know he had a strong relationship with Brian Kennedy and still does.
Am I correct that guy you just named, Wayne Hughes, he was a big reason that Lynn Swann got hired, correct?
Correct, yeah. And they went to college together.
Yeah, excellent judgment that guy clearly has.
But there are, I think Orgeron was more connected to the money people at USC in terms of, not all of them, but like he knew who they were because he had been part of the program for a long time when Pete got it rolling. And even before that, he was there when Paul Hackett was the head coach. So he had time, whereas at Ole Miss, he just was like such an outsider to them. And I think there was a lot of people at Ole Miss who kind of looked down their nose at him because he was like,
that's so crazy to think about because, you think, he's from Louisiana, he talks funny, like all these other, like, because the popular conception, at least, is like part of the reason he didn't, fit in here. Like you talk about the Pat, the Pat Hayden, the country club thing and all that is the USC country club. You can't have a guy who talks like that and looks like that as the head coach at USC.
You can't have a coach who sounds like Sling Blade coaching USC. I mean, like that was the perception.
Yeah. But at the end of the day, and I don't know how this fits, but at the end of the day, I'm not sure how many of the people in that world, are they comfortable with it at arm's length? I mean, are they going to hang out with a lot of the players who come from really different worlds than they come from? I guess the answer is like, if it has to work, because if it doesn't, they're going to turn on it even faster.
Mm-hmm.
And
it gets to that ultimate question. If Ed Orgeron stays at USC, is he the Ed Orgeron who wins a national championship at LSU? And I don't, there's no way to know, but it's one of those fascinating questions about sports generally. Like I asked Kobe this question once, like if you don't play the Jedi, if Jerry West doesn't play the Jedi mind tricks on the New Jersey Nets and Calipari doesn't get cold feet and he drafts you, do you win multiple titles as the whatever pick of the, I keep calling him so good now, calling him the Brooklyn Nets, of the New Jersey Nets. And he says, of course. And, and I didn't expect a different answer, but obviously no, you probably don't.
People like that think differently.
Mm-hmm.
Kevin Sumlin had a really good line once. He was like, every coach thinks that fucked up place, I can fix it.
Yes.
And then you got a bunch of gray hairs in your beard, and you're like, now I get it. Like at some point, if you guys cross paths with Rick Neuheisel, there's some great UCLA stories. Like they're not even, I don't even know if they're like great UCLA, but they're like telling UCLA stories where it's like the level of inane dysfunction that gets in the way of having doesn't mean you can't win there, but just like, I remember there was a story he told, and I can't tell it as well as he can. I can't even tell it well right now, but it's like about he's having some NFL personnel people in where they're going to help UCLA for something, maybe an evaluation. I don't remember what it was, but it turns out all these guys got huge parking tickets. And he was like, wait a minute, like we want them to be here. They're helping us. And it's just like the people are like, we don't care. You're not allowed to do this. And at most other places, that doesn't happen. And it's just like the level of this kind of stuff at some of these places, when you hear the, like the local knowledge, using like a golf term or something. I think that's the stuff that gets lost, right? And I think those are the things that you don't know until you're in the middle of it. Why does this program not constantly not win, right? Or what's the holdup? There's something you just don't know, and then you figure it out once you're in the middle of it, right? Like it's just. There's a lot of stuff that's like that in college athletics. I'm sure there is in other things too, but I guess it comes back to the people who are like different. They're just different, and they don't process the same way. They don't think of things the same way, and they're just so confident in what they're going to do that, they're going to bet on themselves.
So what's the difference though between the guys? Because if they all make that bet, what's the difference between the guys where it pays off and it, Orgeron, whether he bet on himself or was put in a position where he had to, or somebody ended up betting, whatever the situation. But what's the difference between the guys, if they all believe it, between the guys who are correct and the guys who aren't?
I think it's the ones who have enough self-awareness to figure out what they can manage and what they need a little help with, and how they handle their own strengths and weaknesses. Because as great a athlete as Kobe Bryant, it wasn't like he was, the best at every aspect of it, right? It was like, you can't do everything by yourself. You can will it into other people as much as you can, but I think there's something to be said for, what can you trust? What can you get people to believe in, right? And ultimately, like to circle back with Ogeron's evolution, what I thought was telling to me was he would go through these things and it'd be like, it took him a while to trust and believe that he had everything in place for the way it he needed it to be, as opposed to like every team is different, especially in college athletics. You're dealing with 18, 19, 20-year-olds. Even if you have a bunch of the same guys, the balance is different. The roles are different. What you can say to the team, you could say something one way in one year, and then if you try to say it the exact same way the next year, you might lose the team. And I think it's the people who have, I don't know if it's the internal monologue to know, but I just think they're more in tune, and they see things that none of us really see, right? Like, I just think some people are like gifted with a certain kind of, viewpoint. Cause like, I'm trying to remember, there was a player the Nets had. Oh, I know who it was. Like, I'm a Nets fan. So when you were talking about that, I remember.
Right.
But you remember Gerald Green?
Yeah, sure.
Gerald Green must have had like a 49-inch vertical jump or whatever. And like occasionally he would do some remarkable stuff, but he was a really ordinary basketball player, other than the fact that, he could hit his head on the top of the backboard.
He did the cupcake dunk in the dunk contest.
Yeah, it was like Gerald Green, Michael Wilson. There were like a handful of guys like that that were just known for that. But at the same time, it was like there are other guys who are way better basketball players than them. And you just think, okay, you just have this great skill, but it's like ultimately it's like, the guy who's maybe Magic Johnson wasn't the world's best athlete. He was just the best basketball player because he saw things differently. it's rare that the guy who's like the Usain Bolt athletically happens to be the best at, like at basketball or whatever. And I just think it's more mental and more visual. And I think that's where, the Nick Sabans are different. I think that's just where the top guys are different because, look, sometimes they got to be assholes because that's what it takes, right? We saw all that in the Jordan documentary.
Yeah.
Right? So it's like, I don't know. I mean, it's rare to find the guy who's the super nice guy who's also like the best at what they do.
Okay, speaking of that, and this is the last question I have for you.
You set that up well.
You teed this up perfectly. Clay Helton, who is maybe the nicest college football coach I've ever been around. I think he sincerely cares about his athletes in ways that I have rarely, if ever, seen among other college coaches, quite possibly to his own detriment. How do you think he's being evaluated in this type of bizarre year, especially, in light of the fact that Mike Bone opted to keep him? I mean, there was a very controversial, unpopular move.
Well, it would have cost like $45 million for them to unfool all of that.
Yeah.
To get rid of him, bring in a new coaching staff. I'm not sure. Also, if you're going to do that, do you have a slam dunk guy? My impression was I didn't think Carol Folt wanted to hire Urban Meyer.
No.
I don't think she wants to hire James Franklin. And after that, I don't know who you look at and go, oh, that guy's going to come in here and do great. Right? I mean, the expectations are sky high. And so what I think they've done with Clay is I think the new leadership with Bone and Brandon Sosna, who's his right-hand man, has really worked hard to give him a lot of pieces around him. I think they helped him, really supportive in how he put together a staff, which I think he made some really good hires. I like the Todd Orlando hire and some of the guys he brought with him. Recruiting has been splashier, and I think they've ramped up the recruiting office budget, everything that, to match with some of what, at least try to get in the same stratosphere as some of the other schools who are just going ballistic in recruiting. So I think those are big. And the question though ultimately is like, I think Clay is an adult, which is what USC kind of needed coming out of all the dysfunction with Lane and the time Ed was there, then Ed leaves and then Sark comes in and that was a disaster. So I think they needed like an adult in the room, and Clay is an adult. I mean, there's no phony. He's a really nice man, and the question is, how good can they get under him? Because I think they're probably the most talented team in the Pac-12 right now, especially with the guys that have opted out at Oregon, right? Penei Sewell's not there.
I forgot.
Javon Holland, who's a great defensive back, he's gone. They just lost some really good players. And so you don't have to play Alabama in the opener. Like if they had played Alabama, they were looking at maybe a 7-1 start. The question was, how bad was the one going to be? Like, were they going to get blown out of the building, or were they going to be competitive? Now, if they beat ASU, I don't think they're going to have to play a ranked team the rest of the regular season. And they have a really good quarterback in Keaton Slovis, who almost fell in their lap, but he's good. And he was a 3-star guy who looks like way better than that.
He's really good.
Yeah. And so, if Clay manages this well, and there's no clunkers or no, really C performances on a Saturday, then he may be hard to get out of there. And I think the fan base, they're not accepting of him at all. They don't want him as the head coach. But what do you do if you're them?
And he doesn't even talk funny. Like, I don't understand. It really emphasizes a snobbery. It's a fascinating, like the place is just like, and the culture around it is just amazing. Like I went to Vanderbilt, and you talk about James Franklin, like he was the most successful coach we've ever had there by a million. But like, it feels to me like what Vanderbilt would have been if like we were actually good at football. That's what USC is out here. It's just it's fascinating to watch. The book is great. It's Flip the Script: Lessons Learned on the Road to a Championship. Bruce Feldman with Ed Orgeron and The Rock. I was a little disappointed. It says Dwayne Johnson, though. It doesn't just say The Rock.
Yeah,
I know he doesn't do that anymore, but
so.
Also, Bruce, really quick, because you're with The Athletic, also Fox Sports, but The Athletic, your bio does not include Flip the Script. You need to update this.
I know it doesn't. I'm not really great at technology, and I probably need to hustle on that.
Yeah. Well, if it makes you feel better, mine includes a couple jobs that I'm pretty sure I don't currently have. So at least you're forgetting a book you wrote.
I'm currently. We all need to update our athletic bios.
Let's take care of that.
That is good to know. I will actually reach out to our PR person. You know what I would love to do is the last time I was on the road was at the NFL Combine, and they had an offsite for the Athletic, and I don't know, I was probably going on like 4 hours sleep, and they took headshots there, and the headshot was really small, like like on the screen, it's tiny. So I didn't even look at it. And then somebody had me do an interview, and they screenshot, they used that on TV or on it. And I was like, whoa, that's what it's like, seeing HD TV of yourself. I'm like, I hate that photo. I got
Yeah, I've been there.
HD is not good for it. It's a terrible thing for it. We all need that Sybil Shepherd moonlighting kind of fuzzy glow thing.
It's the way I would describe it is it's like, the way you feel when you go out at night, and then all of a sudden after you've had 5 beers and you walk into the bathroom and you look in the mirror and I'm like, oof, I don't know why anybody's talking to me.
Or if you've had 6 beers, you're like, I know why everybody's talking to me. That's the 6th beer. All of a sudden you're like, I look good.
Yeah, you don't know. You look like you don't quite know why you're smiling.
Yeah. I just remember looking in the mirror. I'm like, man, I've aged a lot. And that's in that bright bathroom with all the it's a mess all over the place.
We really appreciate the time, man. Thank you. This was fun. And
thank you guys.
Best of luck with the book, with the rest of the season. Hopefully just everything goes off without a hitch in this insanity that we're living in now. But again, Flip the Script. You can find it on Amazon, anywhere you get books. Really appreciate it, man. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And ask your old ESPN magazine people who those people were.
Yeah, I gotta send off a couple of emails.
Yeah, there's no question. In touch with some of these people. We may need to ask.
No, I would say there would be a good book made if the magazine lasted longer on like some of the crazy stuff that happened there.
It's a shame. It was a good magazine too.
It was a good magazine.
No show tomorrow. We're taking election night off. We're not going to pretend like anybody's interested in talking to us for an hour at 10 o'clock tomorrow. We've got bigger things to do. Wednesday night, though, Anthony Slater from The Athletic will talk some basketball, get a look at the offseason. That's coming up on Wednesday. Again, thanks again to Bruce, and we'll see everybody Wednesday night. Go out and vote if you haven't done it already.
Dank u, Nederland.
Thank you, guys.